I was going through this lesson again this week, and I'm putting it together in this form and stuff, and there's something that really surprised me this week that normally I know what I'm going to say. I have it pretty much in my mind. I have all my notes laid out, and then I pull all my notes. I do it on 4x6 cards. That's my thing now, 4x6 cards. I got all my 4x6 cards out, and I lay out, and as I put something together, I went, at the end of it, I went, wow. Wow. And it has to do with the name of a town called Beersheba. We'll catch that right at the end. Right at the end. So, questions to get you started. We're talking about the Abraham narrative now. We've moved out of the ancients, and we're moving into some more historic, but also epic. Remember, I talked about the historic and the epic are kind of laid one on top of the other. So you know there's history involved because you can tell just by the writing style, by some of the things they talk about, whereas with the creation story, you're just not quite sure whether it's real or not. But with Abraham, it could be practical, it could be real. But there's also this layer of epic over top of it. And so we're in that Abraham cycle. And I like to look at this as a drama. Okay, and who's on the stage of this drama? And we have a lot of characters here that we're going to be talking about, because I'm going to cover all 12 chapters. It's really Genesis 12 through 22. All right, so Genesis 23, 24, and 25 are actually starting something different. We're going to talk about that in a few weeks when we get there. But so we're going to cover an overview of the whole Abraham cycle, the whole Abraham narrative. So who was Abraham? Let's start with him. Who was he?
He was the first patriarch.
First patriarch. Father of many nations, right? Okay. Who's Sarah?
His wife.
His wife.
And as we find out, his sister.
And as we find out later, his sister. Who's Hagar? On stage.
Her Egyptian maid.
Egyptian maid. And who's Ishmael?
Hagar and Abraham's
Hagar
son.
and Abraham got together. Ishmael. Who's Eliezer? Eliezer. Actually, it's A. E is pronounced A. Eliezer. Who's Eliezer?
His chief servant.
Yeah. Big servant. You know all these too, right, Bob? Yeah. Okay. And Lot. Who's Lot? Since Gail's doing all the answering here.
Abraham, and I would assume maybe Sarah's nephew.
And who's Isaac?
Abraham and Sarah's son.
Got it. Piece of cake. So what are all these people like? Do you know anything about their personalities? Do you know anything about them, their personalities? Some of them we do. We
get little pieces. At least.
We get little pieces of Abraham. He's faithfulness, but then he's kind of flawed when especially when he goes down to Egypt and his time with Abimelech. But then he comes back with the binding, the Akedah. You know, we call it the sacrifice of Isaac, but he never really did sacrifice. It's the Akedah, the binding. And then Hagar, we got a little bit of impression of her, but she and Sarah have this unusual position. We're going to spend a whole week just talking about women. And there's an interesting play between the two of them. One of them's dominant at one time, another's dominant at another time, and it causes fights at different times. So, and then the same between Isaac and Ishmael. There's a unique relationship between Isaac and Ishmael. They were both together again for Abe's death. They came back together. So Ishmael did not wander far away. He was close enough to know when and where. And of course there's a lot of stuff we've got to cover with Lot. What's the crisis in the narrative? What's the crisis? Remember this whole narrative here. If you read the whole Abraham cycle, what's the crisis we're talking about here?
I guess the testing of Abraham? I'm not sure exactly how you define crisis.
Well, it's a narrative. Think of it as a book, a book of literature. And in a book of literature, you always have some kind of crisis that leads you along in the story. How is it going to be resolved?
So the ongoing.
The ongoing thing that needs to be resolved at the end, where the climax is at the end. And what is that in this narrative?
Lineage, really.
Okay, explain lineage just a little bit more.
Getting heirs.
Yeah, getting heirs. an heir, because remember, Sarah was barren. Okay? So there's a big promise made, and how's that promise going to be fulfilled in the midst of death and barrenness? Okay? So that's the big crisis that moves this narrative along. And if you remember, if any of you have read a novel, and I'm thinking just about all of you probably have read a novel at one time or another, okay? In that novel, it takes 300 to 400, if it's Stephen King, it takes 800 pages to make this narrative happen, to get this crisis to the point of a climax and finally resolution. And of course the end thing is, well, it's not quite resolved, so I can write a next book, right? Okay, but the Abraham narrative does it in 12 chapters. It does it in 12 chapters, so it's pretty condensed. And there's a lot in it that we're going to find as we go through it. All right, flip the first page to page 14. And let's set the stage of the drama. Let's set the stage. Terah dies in Haran. Who is Terah? Terah is Abraham's father. Okay. Haran dies in Ur. Who's Haran?
His brother.
His brother. Okay, Lot's father. All right. Left was Abraham, Lot, and Sarai. Abram, Lot, and Sarai, to use their original names. Abram, Lot, and Sarai. And Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. It says that very pointedly. Okay, in 11 verse 30. Because she was not able to conceive. And that makes a difference because, as we talked about last week, the Nuzi culture, that contract where a woman's obligation was to provide an heir. And so the blame is on Sarah on this. It's not on Abraham on this one. Okay, the blame is on Sarah. So here they are. And again, remember when I closed out part 1, I said if this is how it ends, it's a pretty depressing book so far. But obviously it's not how it ends. So we're starting with death, and then we're starting with barrenness. So Genesis 12, 1-7 says this: The Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." And then the first, and you'll notice it's in poetry form in your Bibles, and then I tried to keep it here too. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And all the people on earth will be blessed through you." Now there's different translations for that. If you have your Bibles, there's a footnote telling you the different translations. And I'm going to go into that a little bit in that literary nuances on the next page. So Abraham went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, and all their possessions that they had accumulated, and the people they acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan. And they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Morah at Shechem. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who appeared to him. Okay, so this is the beginning of the Abraham narrative. This is the beginning. And what it does is it sets the stage, and it also establishes the crisis, right? Because we know Sarah is barren. And now all of a sudden we're going, I'm going to make you into a great nation. So it sets the stage for the drama. There's some literary nuances. Page 15. The downer of an introduction. Introducing the drama. Death and barrenness. So we're starting with the concept of death and barrenness. Okay? The Lord said to Abraham. Now notice what name is used for God. Yahweh, which came during Moses' time. Again, this is more indicative of the covenantal God. And you can tell that with Abraham. He's establishing the covenant with Abraham. Now it goes back and forth with God and with the Lord, or with El and Yahweh. But this one particularly. Again, it's the covenantal God Yahweh, not El. Yahweh is beginning a new dispensation of himself and his relation to the world. I think this is important, so we'll go over this a bit. Instead of giving his people everything they needed, including free will, and seeing it fail 3 times in a big way, he chooses a special person to be a special people that he will guide and direct to bless all the nations, all other nations. He starts a new concept here called holiness. The concept is not here before, meaning separate, set apart, different. While God himself was holy, again because of that non-God space, he has to separate himself from creation. There were no people set apart to be holy from the rest of the population. So through the Adam narrative, through the Cain and Abel narrative, through the Noah narrative, there really was not a concept of holiness, of being set apart, of being separate. It was God trying to get this whole unruly crowd of humans to do what they're supposed to do, and they just didn't. Adam and Eve sinned, Cain and Abel sinned, the people before the flood, the people before the Tower of Babel. In a big way, these people kept failing, so God changes things. We call this a dispensation, but that's kind of a scary word because you have your dispensationalists who believe that this is a new means of salvation. And I'm not sure it's that, because I think it echoes what's in the New Testament. It's a further revelation, this dispensation. So God basically says, okay, Judy, I'm going to pick you out of this whole room, and I'm going to really focus my attention on you so that you then can bless all the other people. That's different. Instead of saying, I'm going to try to give you all you need and give you what you need, everybody, he says, I'm going to now focus on one person and one people group. And that's where the concept of holiness comes. Okay, we think of holiness as being high and mighty. That's not it. It means separate, set apart, special. I'm going to focus on you. Okay, this is a new concept starting here in chapter 12. I will make you into a great nation. Your offspring I will give this land. Here sets up the drama in direct contrast with the barrenness that we have promised. We have a promise of amazing fruitfulness. The people, oh I'm sorry, I skipped a whole one, didn't I? Let's go back up to, so Abraham went, then he took. Don't you normally take, pick up, pack up, arrange your stuff, and then go? Okay, the verbs are kind of mixed up here. He went, and then he packed up all his stuff. The verbs are mixed up here. In the narrative, the author wants to give you the concept of Abram's obedience. So when God says go, Abraham went. If the narrative showed Abraham packing and planning, it would have detracted from his extreme obedience. So God says go, Abraham went. And then the next sentence is, and he packed up Lot and Sarah and all his household and everything else. Okay, so it's kind of the opposite, but again, the author wants to make a point. God said go, Abraham went. Okay, so that's the concept he wants to give to us. Okay, now to the next one. I will make you into a great nation, your offspring, setting up the drama in contrast to the barrenness with fruitfulness. The people at the time would have been on the edge of their seats, wondering how this was going to happen. How was this drama going to play out? So you can just imagine Sarah being barren, Abram already 75 years old, and then God says, hey, you're going to have a ton of children. And they're going, wait, what? What? So here the drama is starting of this whole play, this whole narrative. In fact, add to that the great name, okay, that you will be seen as blessed. And the people will use your name as an idiom for being blessed, which are alternate translations of the poem. Let's look at that poem again on page 14. I will make you into a great nation and bless you. That's pretty straightforward and pretty much the same any way you want to translate it. I will make your name great, and you will be seen as blessed. Okay, that's the alternate translation. Everybody's going to look and go, wow, look at Abraham. He is so blessed. Okay, and then the next phrase, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and the people of the earth will be blessed because of you. The phrase is the people will use your name as a blessing. And I use the word idiom there. We know that word, right? A colloquialism, an idiom. And if I say to Bob, you're like Abraham, everybody would know what I mean is he is extremely blessed. Okay, your name will be known as blessed, almost identical. Okay? Now we read our own kind of translation into that, saying that Abraham will be blessed so that he may bless others. And that's fulfilled later. Okay, but here it's more talking about making his name synonymous with blessing. Fruitful. Okay, lots of children. So here we have the drama. Here we have the crisis building in this narrative, that he's barren, but his name is going to be referred to as blessed. An idiom for blessed. So we have two promises so far. One, you will be a great nation. And two, your offspring will have this land. We have two promises so far. And that's going to build. But let's first look at the characters that help solve the conflict. So if you want to look at page 16 and 17 together, if you can stretch them out that way. So we're going to talk about these heirs. As we go through all 12 of these chapters here, there are 4 possibilities for heirs here. The first is Lot. The first potential heir is Lot. And I have that graph on page 17 again that I showed you last week. As the drama builds up, and then all of a sudden you're let down, but then it comes right back up again. Okay? The first potential heir is Lot. Yet in Genesis 13 we find a conflict between Lot and Abram. While Abram gives Lot, that should be capitalized, gives Lot his choice of places to go, they separate. So Lot chooses for himself the whole plain of Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company, and Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tent near Sodom. So heir number 1 is out. Okay, so we just lost Lot. The drama is still going, right? You can see it building. We thought maybe, your nephew would take over for you. Nope, not going to happen. The second potential heir is Eliezer. In Genesis 15, we're introduced to Eliezer of Damascus as Abram's loyal servant, soon to be heir. Yet God says, this man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. So here we think it's Eliezer, okay, because we talked about that last week, and again, the newsy city, that we found that it was very common. If the man could not conceive, okay, if the woman could not conceive, she was supposed to find a handmaiden or somebody else to produce an heir. But if the man could not conceive, then he could take his nephew, family member, or a servant. And that would be Eliezer. So that would be following in line with the law at that time. Okay, but God says it's going to be someone from your own body, your own flesh and blood. So Eliezer is out as a potential heir. All right? Let's look at the third potential heir, Ishmael. Okay, now we finally got somebody of his own flesh and blood. In Genesis 16, we are introduced to Ishmael as Abram's natural-born son. But he is listed as a wild donkey of a man, an idiom for stubborn and willful. And yet we find in Genesis 21 that Ishmael is sent away because of the conflict between Sarai and Hagar and the 2 children. So, Ishmael. Okay, now can you see the drama keeps building more and more. So now off the stage, we have Hagar and Ishmael have all been taken off the stage, as well as Lot and Eliezer. All these are now off the stage. All we have left are Abraham and Sarah and this mystery guest. Right? The heir, Isaac, the child of Abram and Sarah, now is born, and we find the conflict resolved. The Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abram in his old age, at that very time that God had promised him. All right? So we have Lot. Finally, so we got that graph building drama. We got, I'm sorry, I said Lot. We've got Isaac. We finally have Isaac. And so, okay, the graph goes down, conflict is resolved, everybody's happy. But wait, the conflict drama is not over yet. Then God said, quote, take your son, your only son. An interesting phrase, don't you think? When we're talking about this guy right here too. Take your son, your only son. And we're going to talk about this too as we talk about the Akedah. Whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you. Wait a minute, suddenly our drama shoots straight up again, our conflict. What's going on here? Even Abraham had the same conflict. If you remember the narrative, he said perhaps he thought in his heart, or actually Hebrews talks about Abraham thinking perhaps in his heart that God would bring him back to life again or produce another heir again. So Abraham did as God asked him to. And then finally the conflict is resolved. Yay! It is Isaac who's the heir, and Abraham has proved faithful. Abraham proves himself faithful, and God says, now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. So all the crowds are now cheering as you're hearing this from the narrator telling you this story. Everybody's excited. It is Isaac. All right. The next part of it is the promise. Now this I think you're going to find a little unique as we go through, because you probably heard that it's basically one promise given to Abraham from God. But what we have here, and I'm showing it on page 18 and 19, is an increase in the drama of the promise, an increase in the intensity of the promise. There's actually 7 different promises here. Promise number 1 we already talked about. Genesis 12, 2-3, it is poetry, so probably was drawn from some kind of a song or a poem that was recited or sung frequently as children of Abraham. So in Moses' time, this was probably a poem or something that you sang or you knew as a child, passed from person to person, that you will be a great nation. Promise number 2, your offspring will live in Canaan. Remember that promise as he got there? Okay, Genesis 12, verse 7, after this, Abraham builds an altar to thank the Lord for his promise. And that's an act of faith. An act of faith. Because again, he's expecting this to be fulfilled, even though there's no evidence. And it won't be fulfilled for how many years? How old was Abraham when he moved to Canaan? 75. And how old was he when Isaac was born? 100. 25 years he had to wait for this promise. Promise number 3 comes a little bit later in Genesis 13, that this land will be yours forever. Big promise even Israel today stands on. God enhances or builds up his promise. Not only will you possess this land, you will do it forever. Promise number 4, your offspring will be uncountable. Genesis 13, verse 16, another enhancement of a previous promise, increasing the drama from just a great nation to offspring like the dust of the earth. Promise number 5, I am Yahweh, King. I am great, great giver is my translation. Okay, Genesis 15:1. This section uses some literary tricks. Translated as I am your shield, is what the translation says, can also mean sovereign or king. I am is a play on the name of God, right? Yahweh, I am that I am, which the audience would have heard. I am your king, Yahweh your king. Okay, also, I am your great great. There's a doubling of that word for emphasis in the Hebrew. And there's alliteration. And giver, which is my translation to keep the alliteration in the passage, great great giver. And in Hebrew it was alliteration like that, using, not G obviously, but using alliteration. So I am your king, I am your great great giver. Okay? Interesting that this also comes right after the saving of Lot and all of those kings who want to give Abraham stuff for saving them. Also his encounter with Pharaoh in Egypt. So Abraham just had a whole bunch of encounters with kings. Remember the story? He went out and saved Lot and the king of Sodom and all the other kings that tried to battle. And he's the one that went out and saved them and brought them all back, brought all their people back. So Melchizedek, the king, is there. Melchizedek is one of those kings. And Abraham actually gives him something, a tithe, right? So here, the very next chapter, we have God saying, I am your king. Okay? Remember, he refused to accept anything from those other kings. And God says, I am your king, and I am your great, great giver. So those are tied together. Promise number 6, your son will be of your own flesh, not adopted. So an intensity of it, because at that time we still thought maybe Eliezer or Lot, or, okay. Knocks out Eliezer as his heir, but also a ramp up in the drama, since he is still childless and Sarah is still barren. God seals the promise with an ancient ritual. Okay, this isn't a promise, this is just kind of a sealing of the promise with an ancient ritual. Now we're going to spend some time talking about this ritual later. Okay, Genesis 15, 9 to 20. This ritual where the two parties in a covenant walk between the halves of slain, halved animals. It was a custom in the Ugarit. Remember that, the place of the Ugarit? It's just a little bit north of Israel on the Mesopotamia, on the Mediterranean River. It's just a little bit north of Israel. It's called Ugarit. It's the name of a place and the name of a people. That was very common. They found evidence of that, where they would cut an animal literally in half, put the two halves down, and then the two parties would walk in between. And the symbolism of it was, may this be done to me if I don't keep this contract. May you cut me if I don't keep the contract. Okay? Or the covenant. Now what's the rule of thumb difference between a covenant and a contract again?
Contract or equal parties, covenant is one powerful, one
Right.
lesser.
Okay, so contract is between equal parties. A covenant is between a greater and a lesser. Okay? Between a king and a vassal, between a lord and his servant, between God and man are covenants. Okay, so God seals it with this ancient ritual. He does it, and there's a whole interesting story there that I'm not sure we're going to get to spend too much time on, but there's a whole interesting story there. Basically, it's saying if I don't keep my part. Now you'll notice Abraham did not pass between the halves. We're going to talk about that coming up pretty right now. Promise number 7. Name changes to Abram and Sarah. Abram to Abraham, Sarah to Sarah. Sarai to Sarah. Genesis 17 verse 5 and verse 15. Not just one nation will come from Abraham and Sarai, but many nations. Okay, so can you see the ramp up of the drama here? Will come from Abraham and Sarah. Also included this was the sealing of Abraham's end of the bargain with another cutting. Another cutting called circumcision. Okay? Not a new concept, but newly attached to the covenant. Just as God walked between the cut halves of the animals in the previous chapter to symbolize his commitment, now must Abraham and his offspring be cut to symbolize their fulfillment of walking before God faithfully and blamelessly. Genesis 17:1. We're supposed to walk before him faithfully and blamelessly. That's intimately tied to circumcision. God's part of it was walking between the cut halves. Abram's part of it was circumcision. Promise fulfilled. Top of page 19. Isaac is born. Genesis 21, 1 to 5. Finally the drama is resolved and Isaac is born. But wait, the same thing, right? So these are tied together. The promises are with Isaac, just like the heir. But wait, the conflict is not over yet. God says, take your son. And then, yay, it's Isaac. Again. So the crowds are going wild. Because at the end of the narrative, now we know it's Isaac. Okay? Isaac, who is the heir, and Abraham has proved faithful. Abraham proves faithful, and God says, now I know you fear. Now look at the red here. Because you have done this, I will surely bless you, and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand of the seashore. They will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. So again, you see the graph. Promises 1 through 7, ramping up the drama. Isaac is finally born, the son of promise, the heir of all of that. The sacrifice suddenly ramps it up again. And then, yay, it's Isaac. It's resolved. Now, a couple of interesting things that we're going to talk about as we conclude this lesson. Genesis 12 to 22 is what I call the concluding. Now there's some interesting things going on in Genesis 23 to 24 that we'll talk about as transitional chapters. But the concluding phrase, then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba. And Abram stayed in Beersheba. Is that the last verse of Genesis 22? You got your Bible right there?
No, it's.
Oh, that's right, there's the genealogy
Yeah,
there. Sorry.
neighbors,
Okay. So what does Beersheba mean? Before you read it, anybody know? Beersheba. Beer is the Hebrew word for well. Like you dig a well. But it came to be known as a place of promise because Abraham and Abimelech made promises there, and Isaac talks about promises there as well. So Beer means promise or place of promise. Sheba or Sheba means 7. Shabbat is the 7th day. So combine the two, and Abraham lived the rest of his life in the land of the 7 promises. Does that strike anybody as whoa? Because we just talked about that. Didn't we talk about this 7 distinct promises? And so Abraham lived in the land of God's promises. I think that is so cool. That's what struck me this week as I was going through this. I just like the way the narrator wrapped it up nicely and said, and Abraham lived in the land of God's promises, the 7 promises. Now remember, this narrative is also in chiastic form. It's a chiasm, which draws your attention to the center of the chiasm. Chiasm, again, is the Greek letter chi, or X, and it brings narratives down to a center point, and then it brings the same equal ones away from that center point, all drawing your focus to the center of the chiasm. It starts with the genealogy of Terah, it ends with the genealogy of Nahor. B1, the start of this spiritual odyssey. B2 is the end of his spiritual odyssey with Isaac. C1 is Sarah in a foreign palace. C2, Sarah in a foreign palace. Did you ever wonder why he just did put those 2 narratives right in the same time? He did it in Egypt and then he did it to Abimelech right later. No, he separated them to keep them consistent in this chiasm. Did they actually happen in that order? Probably not. Okay. But again, this narrative was constructed for a purpose. Not to tell you this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. It's to say, I want to make you a point. I want to tell a story that has a point. D1, Abraham comes to the rescue of Lot and the kings. D2, Abraham comes to the rescue of Sodom and Lot. Why is that particular story thrown in the middle of it, this whole Sodom story? And then E1, the covenant and annunciation of Ishmael. And E2, the covenant and annunciation of Isaac. Which brings us to the center of the chiasm. The focus is the name changes. The 7th promise of the Lord, when he appeared, and he appeared to Abraham for the first time. This is the first time we know he appeared. It says literally, he appeared to Abraham. Okay, before he spoke to him in a dream, or he spoke to him, we don't know what it means, but here all of a sudden God appeared to Abraham. We're not sure how he did it, but Genesis, shoot, I didn't write down what passage it was. I think it's like 17 verse 1, something like that, that he appeared to Abraham. All right. Then Genesis 23 to 24 are those transitional chapters. We will discuss in a future lesson the setup and definition of the promise. Isaac and Canaan. Now, this is unusual because there are 3 cycles. We have the Abraham cycle, the Jacob cycle, and the Joseph cycle in Genesis. But we don't have much on Isaac. Or do we? And that's what we're going to look at when we get to that. We got a few more inside this narrative of Genesis 12 to 22. We want to talk about the women in this passage, which is unique. We're going to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot, which is unique. We're going to talk about the Akedah, the sacrifice, the binding of Isaac. Akedah, A-K-K-I-D-A, Akedah. Well, maybe it's A-H-K, I-D-A, Akedah, which means the binding. All right? So Isaac is an unusual character. Number of reasons, and we'll get to that, but one is, he's the only one that was monogamous. Right? He's the only one that never left Canaan. He was born raised, died in Canaan. He was the child of promise. He symbolizes, the reason for that is he symbolizes Canaan and the promise, the promised land. Okay, it would be synonymous to say that under Moses' time they're going to the Isaac, or to say we're going to the promised land. We're going back to Isaac. Okay, that's the nature of the narrative here that they want to establish. That's why there's no Isaac cycle. There's an Abraham, a Jacob, and a Joseph. No Isaac, because Isaac is through the whole thing as the promise. So the author begins now to define who Israel is. Remember last week we talked about the purpose for the cycles. As we get into more of the historical narrative as opposed to this ancient narrative, the historical narrative is to give you an identity as a people. So the people are starting to establish their identity. So how would you define Israel? How would Israel see themselves based on this narrative so far? How would they see themselves?
As the people of the promise, I guess.
People of the promise. Yeah. What were you going to say, Sharon?
Well, the ancient history, the lineage was.
Yeah, they're going to see that they were that not only a special people, but God had planned on throughout Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, all of the 12. Right? What else? There's some themes that are starting to come out, and I've touched on them briefly. Anybody remember the themes I talked about? Of the definition of Israel, how Israel sees itself. There's a sense of the barren woman in here, this undercurrent of the downtrodden, of the unblessed that becomes blessed. So you have a lot of barren women in Israel's narratives, right? If you just remember throughout all of your history of Israel, there's a lot of barren women. Okay, and so, I mean, the next one is Rebecca is barren with Isaac, and then you have Rachel, which is barren with Jacob. You have other barrenness with Tamar later, and we got all kinds of the barren women narrative that's going through. Okay, now there's also the narrative, as Israel defines itself, kind of in the same way. It's kind of like the unblessed becoming blessed, or the downtrodden being made holy, separate, set apart. There's that sense of identity that they're through the second son narrative. Now we normally think Abraham was the oldest. Well, tradition holds he probably wasn't. It was that Haran that died earlier, way back in Ur, that was the oldest. And that was the reason why Terah left Ur for the city Haran. So don't get the name Haran with the city Haran mixed up. So Abraham's older brother Haran died in Ur, and so Dad moved Abraham, Dad meaning Terah, moved Abraham and Lot and Sarah to the city of Haran. And something to start something new. And then Terah dies, of course, in Haran. So then Abraham, who was not the oldest, is now the head of the family. And of course we have that with Isaac and Ishmael, we have that with Jacob and Esau, we have that with Joseph, we have that with Ephraim and Manasseh being switched. We have a lot of that. We have that with Moses. All of this is the story of the younger son. The downtrodden becoming so that's how Israel sees itself. It didn't see itself, or it's not defining itself as this great nation that was a great nation and always will be a great nation, kind of like Babylon and Assyria and Ur and all of these other contemporaries that said that they are a great nation and they always will be a great nation. Egypt. Okay, all of them, that's how they define themselves. We're a great nation, we always will be a great nation. Israel saw themselves as, we were nobody, no mans, wandering around. But God chose us for a special purpose. You see that definition kind of starting to come out in this narrative, and that was a point behind it. But that's what they heard at that time. So what do we draw today? What can we draw from this today? Knowing what's behind the Abraham narrative, knowing how they're starting to identify themselves as Hebrews, ancient Hebrews, how can we translate that to us today?
I like to think that God uses imperfect people like me.
God uses
I see
imperfect
that.
people to,
Yeah.
yeah, to accomplish His blessing of all nations. Yeah. So I picked out Judy before and said that the change now from the ancient narrative to this Abraham narrative, the change that happens is God says, I'm not going to aim my focus on everybody anymore like I did with Adam and Eve, like I did with Cain and Abel, and before the flood and before the tower. I'm going to focus on one particular people. I'm going to focus on Judy. And then through Judy, the rest of you are going to be blessed. Through Israel, through the Hebrews, the rest of you are going to be blessed. So he's focusing on one people group and the beginning of holiness. Are we a holy people? Should we be a holy people? That's the easier question, right? Separate, set apart. That's what our concept of holiness is starting to be defined now. It was never there before. That concept that there's something different about me versus another person. There's something different about us. We are chosen. We are God's people. And of course, that's emphasized in the New Testament with Paul, with us being the new Abraham's children and stuff like that. So. All right. Next week, Genesis, we're still covering that same area, but we want you to talk about our focus mainly on 12 verse 10 to 20 and 20 verse 1 to 18. It's those two narratives we talked about, where Abraham seems to go a little loony and say to his wife, hey, why don't you pretend to be my sister so I don't get killed? Okay, so we're going to talk actually, why really did he do it? What was God's response? I think that's just as interesting. And what do you think is the Egyptian connection here? Okay, again, I have Egyptian colored glasses on, but what do you think is the Egyptian connection here? There's a very interesting connection in Egypt. Not only because of one of them occurred in Egypt, but just the concept itself of this presenting your wife as your sister. It's an interesting Egyptian concept in there too. So do a little research, see what you can find. I was going through this lesson again this week, and I'm putting it together in this form and stuff, and there's something that really surprised me this week that normally I know what I'm going to say. I have it pretty much in my mind. I have all my notes laid out, and then I pull all my notes. I do it on 4x6 cards. That's my thing now, 4x6 cards. I've got all my 4x6 cards out, and I lay out, and as I put something together, I went, at the end of it, I went, wow. Wow. And it has to do with the name of a town called Beersheba. We'll catch that right at the end. Right at the end. So, questions to get you started. We're talking about the Abraham narrative now. We've moved out of the ancients, and we're moving into some more historic, but also epic. Remember, I talked about the historic and the epic are kind of laid one on top of the other. So you know there's history involved because you can tell just by the writing style, by some of the things they talk about, whereas with the creation story, you're just not quite sure whether it's real or not. But with Abraham, it could be practical, it could be real. But there's also this layer of epic over top of it. And so we're in that Abraham cycle. And I like to look at this as a drama. Okay, and who's on the stage of this drama? And we have a lot of characters here that we're going to be talking about, because I'm going to cover all 12 chapters. It's really Genesis 12 through 22. Abraham's father. Okay, Haran dies in Ur. Who's Haran?
His brother.
His brother. Okay, Lot's father. All right. Left was Abraham, Lot, and Sarai. Abram, Lot, and Sarai, to use their original names. Abram, Lot, and Sarai. And Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. It says that very pointedly. Okay, in 11 verse 30. Because she was not able to conceive. And that makes a difference because, as we talked about last week, the Nuzi culture, that contract where a woman's obligation was to provide an heir. And so the blame is on Sarah on this. It's not on Abraham on this one. Okay, the blame is on Sarah. So here they are. And again, remember when I closed out part 1, I said if this is how it ends, it's a pretty depressing book so far. But obviously it's not how it ends. So we're starting with death, and then we're starting with barrenness. So Genesis 12, 1-7 says this, "The Lord said to Abraham, 'Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you.'" And then the first, and you'll notice it's in poetry form in your Bibles, and then I tried to keep it here too. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and who
We get little pieces at
we
least.
get little pieces of Abraham. He's faithfulness, but then he's kind of flawed when especially when he goes down to Egypt and his time with Abimelech. But then he comes back with the binding, the Akedah. You know, we call it the sacrifice of Isaac, but he never really did sacrifice. It's the Akedah, the binding. And then Hagar, we got a little bit of impression of her, but she and Sarah have this unusual position. We're going to spend a whole week just talking about women. And there's an interesting play between the two of them. One of them's dominant at one time, another's dominant at another time, and it causes fights at different times. So, and then the same between Isaac and Ishmael. There's a unique relationship between Isaac and Ishmael. They were both together again for Abe's death. They came back together. So Ishmael did not wander far away. He was close enough to know when and where. And of course there's a lot of stuff we've got to cover with Lot. What's the crisis in the narrative? What's the crisis? This is, remember this whole narrative here, if you read the whole Abraham cycle, what's the crisis we're talking about here?
I guess the testing of Abraham? I'm not
Testing?
sure exactly how you define crisis.
Well, it's a narrative. Think of it as a book, a literature, a book of literature. And in a book of literature, you always have some kind of crisis that leads you along in the story. How is it going to be resolved?
So the ongoing.
The ongoing
Okay.
thing that needs to be resolved at the end, where the climax is at the end. And what is that in this narrative?
Lineage, really.
Okay, explain lineage just a little bit more.
Getting heirs.
Yeah,
Having
an heir. An heir, because remember, Sarah was barren. Okay, so there's a big promise made, and how's that promise going to be fulfilled in the midst of death and barrenness? Okay, so that's the big crisis that moves this narrative along. And if you remember, if any of you have read a novel, and I'm thinking just about all of you probably have read a novel at one time or another, okay, in that novel, it takes 300 to 400, if it's Stephen King, it takes 800 pages to make this narrative happen, to get this crisis to the point of a climax and finally resolution. And of course the end thing is, well, it's not quite resolved, so I can write a next book, right? Okay, but in the Abraham narrative does it in 12 chapters. It does it in 12 chapters, so it's pretty condensed. And there's a lot in it that we're going to find as we go through it. All right, flip the first page to page 14. And let's set the stage of the drama. Let's set the stage. Terah dies in Haran. Who is Terah? Terah is Abraham. All right, so Genesis 23, 24, and 25 are actually starting something different. We're going to talk about that in a few weeks when we get there. But we're going to cover an overview of the whole Abraham cycle, the whole Abraham narrative. So who was Abraham? Let's start with him. Who was he?
He was the first patriarch.
First patriarch. Father of many nations, right? Okay. Who's Sarah?
His wife.
His wife.
And as we find out, his sister.
And as we find out later, his sister. Who's Hagar? On stage.
Her Egyptian maid.
Egyptian maid. And who's Ishmael?
Hagar and Abraham's
Hagar
son.
and Abraham got together. Ishmael. Who's Eliezer? Eliezer. Actually, it's A. E is pronounced A. Eliezer. Who's Eliezer?
His chief servant.
Big servant. You know all these too, right, Bob?
Yeah.
Okay. And Lot. Who's Lot? Since Gail's doing all the answering here.
Abraham, and I would assume maybe Sarah's nephew.
Nephew. And who's Isaac?
Abraham and Sarah's son.
Got it. Piece of cake. So what are all these people like? Do you know anything about their personalities? You know anything about them, their personalities? Some of them we do. We